Boris bustled about the shed, a whirlwind of enthusiasm and mismatched socks.
Thomas, ever the pragmatist in his patched-up overalls, cautiously surveyed the scene. "Mars, eh, Boris? You sure about this?" he muttered, scratching his beard.
"Of course, dear brother," boomed Boris, brandishing a wrench with gusto. "We'll be the first men on Mars. Imagine the glory, the adventure."
Thomas, ever the voice of reason, pointed out the obvious. "Don't you need a, rocket for that?"
Boris, momentarily stumped, recovered with a wink. "Details, Thomas, details. We'll build one, a big one, with comfy chairs and a biscuit compartment."
Their neighbor, Mrs. Peabody, peered over the fence, her prize-winning petunias trembling slightly. "Off on another adventure, are we, boys?" she quipped, her tone a mixture of amusement and apprehension.
"Just Mars, Mrs. P. Back in a jiffy," chirped Boris, already halfway through a convoluted explanation of their foolproof navigation system involving a compass, a rubber band, and a generous helping of luck.
Thomas merely sighed and shook his head. This was going to be interesting. Days turned into weeks, filled with the clang of metal, the sizzle of welding torches, and Boris's increasingly outlandish pronouncements.
"This, my dear Thomas," he declared one afternoon, gesturing grandly at their creation, "is no mere rocket. It's a masterpiece."
Thomas, covered in grease and clutching a spanner, could only stare in disbelief. The contraption, looming before them, with its distinctive 4 funnels and oddly familiar shape, bore a striking resemblance to a certain ill-fated ocean liner.
"Boris," Thomas began cautiously, "are you sure we're looking at the same plans? Because this looks suspiciously like—"
"The Titanic," Boris finished proudly. "Sturdy, reliable, and spacious enough for all our Mars snacks. What could be better?"
Thomas, realizing the futility of arguing, simply pinched the bridge of his nose.
Boris, the Titanic sank.
Boris, unfazed, waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense, that was just bad luck. We'll be fine. Besides," he added with a wink, "we're going to Mars, not America. Completely different direction."
The day of the launch arrived, a crisp and sunny Saturday. Boris, decked out in a makeshift spacesuit fashioned from a boiler suit and a fishbowl helmet, was practically vibrating with excitement.
"Crackers, Boris! Did you pack the crackers?" Thomas called out, wrestling with a particularly stubborn hatch.
Boris froze, his face paling. "Crackers? Oh, blast. Knew there was something I forgot."
"Crackers! That's your biggest concern right now," exclaimed Thomas, throwing his hands up in the air.
"Well, we can't very well go to Mars on an empty stomach, can we?" retorted Boris, pulling out a lone, slightly squashed banana. "This will have to do."
Thomas, torn between amusement and despair, shook his head and ticked off another item on his rapidly dwindling list.
"Right, next up, oxygen. Did you remember the oxygen tanks, Boris?"
A heavy silence descended upon the shed. Boris's face, previously alight with excitement, now resembled a deflated balloon.
"Oxygen," he squeaked, his voice barely a whisper.
Thomas, his patience wearing thin, fixed Boris with a withering stare. "Oxygen, Boris. You know that stuff we need to breathe, the thing that's noticeably absent on Mars?"
Boris, in a moment of uncharacteristic clarity, realized the gravity of their oversight.
"Oh, right, that oxygen."
Panicked now, Boris began rummaging through a toolbox filled with assorted nuts, bolts, and a rather dusty rubber chicken.
"Don't worry, Thomas. I'm sure we can improvise something," he declared, his voice laced with forced optimism.
Thomas, massaging his temples, could only watch in dismay as Boris attempted to fashion makeshift oxygen masks from tea strainers and garden hose. This was going to be a long trip.
"We're off."
With a mighty clang and a shudder that rattled Mrs. Peabody's teacups next door, the rocket sputtered to life.
Boris cried triumphantly, pulling levers and twisting knobs with reckless abandon.
Thomas, strapped precariously into a deck chair pilfered from a seaside pier, clung on for dear life.
"Boris, how do we steer this thing?"
Boris, momentarily flustered, glanced around the cockpit, which resembled a cross between a ship's bridge and a junkyard.
"Ah, yes, steering. Just like sailing a boat, really."
With a mighty heave, Boris spun the wheel, causing the rocket to lurch violently sideways.
"Left a bit. No, my left. Oh, blast it all."
He wrestled with the controls, the vessel swaying precariously as it ascended into the sky.
"Boris, I think we've taken a wrong turn,"
shouted Thomas, pointing out the window. Below, instead of the shrinking landscape of their hometown, stretched a vast expanse of blue.
"That's the Atlantic Ocean, isn't it?"
An ocean.
"Boris, Mars is red. Are you sure that's not just a very large puddle?"
But Mars is red. Are you sure that's not just a very large puddle?
That, my dear Boris, is an iceberg, and unless my geography is completely off, we seem to be headed straight for it.
Panic set in. Boris, never one to be fazed for long, sprang into action.
Don't worry, Thomas. I saw this in a film once. We just need to reverse the polarity of the neutron flow.
Boris, we don't have a neutron flow.
But it was too late. The rocket collided with the iceberg with a sickening crunch, sending tremors throughout the makeshift vessel. The dust settled, revealing that miraculously the rocket remained intact, albeit slightly worse for wear.
Well, at least we're on solid ground now. Mars, here we come.
Boris, we're on an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and we still haven't solved the minor issue of, breathing on Mars.
Leave that to me, dear brother.
With a flourish, Boris unveiled his creation. A system of interconnected tubes and filters that, according to him, would convert the Martian atmosphere into breathable air. Needless to say, Boris's invention didn't quite work as planned. They were rescued from their icy predicament by Mrs. Peabody's nephew, who just so happened to be captain of a passing cruise ship. Back in their shed, surrounded by the wreckage of their rocket, Boris remained undeterred.
Well, back to the drawing board. This time we'll build a spaceship that can actually fly.
Just promise me one thing, Boris. Next time, let's stick to the blueprints, shall we?
And so, the adventures of Boris and Thomas continued, a testament to the enduring power of brotherly bonds, unyielding optimism, and a healthy disregard for the laws of physics. Later that night, as Boris snored peacefully amidst a pile of blueprints, Thomas sat by the fire nursing a cup of tea. He picked up a discarded manual, its cover barely clinging on.
Boris's Rocket Building Guide for Beginners, he read aloud, a chuckle escaping his lips.
Flipping through the pages, he stumbled upon a highlighted passage.
Important note. This guide is for building rockets, not replicas of the RMS Titanic.
Thomas sighed, shaking his head.
Oh, Boris, will you ever learn?
A lone, slightly squashed banana sat on top of the page, a silent reminder of Boris's priorities.